Confirming the fears that George Washington mentioned in his farewell address, the election of 1796 was the first openly partisan election in American history. Led by Alexander Hamilton, who was unable to run for the presidency, having been born in the West Indies, Federalists selected Vice President John Adams as their candidate. Adams had served in the Continental Congress, been a part of the committee to draft the Declaration of Independence, served as representative to France, helped negotiate the peace treaty, and served 2 terms as vice president. Thomas Pinckney of South Carolina was their vice presidential choice. On the other side of the aisle, Democratic Republicans supported former Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson, along with James Madison, the most visible opponent of Alexander Hamilton. New Yorker Aaron Burr was intended as vice president. Although contested, the election of 1796 was not decided by popular majority. State legislatures chose 2/5 of the members of the Electoral College. Moreover, procedures in the Electoral College did not distinguish between votes for the office of president and the vice president. The person who received the most electoral votes became president, and the one who received the second most votes became vice president. This procedure proved dangerously unpredictable in a new age of political parties. Although the Federalist Adams received a majority of electoral votes and became president, the Democratic-Republican Jefferson received the second highest count and became vice president. To put this in some kind of perspective in the contemporary era, this would be like if the Electoral College voted and gave the most votes to Democratic Barack Obama, who became president, and then the second most votes to Republican Mitt Romney, who became his vice president. Can you imagine the kind of drama that would ensue to have a president of one political party and a vice president of another? So our Constitution didn't originally call for electors to cast separate ballots for the president and the vice president because it wasn't written with any thought of organized partisan competition for the presidency. And this doesn't change until 1804 with the ratification of the 12th Amendment, which replaced Article 2, Section 1, and Clause 3 of the Constitution. For its part, the Adams administration got off to a pretty rocky start from which it never really recovered. Adams had been a lawyer before the Revolution. He was a veteran of both Continental Congresses. He had been a diplomat in Europe for a decade and had served as Washington's vice president for 8 years. But despite this extraordinarily rich background in public affairs, he was very much politically naive. Scrupulously honest but quick to take offense, he lacked the politician's touch for inspiring personal loyalty and crafting compromises based on a realistic recognition of mutual self-interest. Adams spent most of his administration fighting Alexander Hamilton for leadership of the Federalist Party, as being president in this time period did not make one the de facto leader of the party. John Adams' style was to leave domestic matters to Congress and to control foreign policy himself. Not only did the Constitution vest the president with responsibility for foreign policy, but perhaps no other American had as much diplomatic experience as Adams, and as a result of his outlook, much of his domestic policy is intertwined with his foreign policy, for diplomatic issues often sparked a domestic reaction that consumed the president and the nation. And so in this particular lecture, we're sort of weaving his foreign policy and his domestic policy together. But by putting the interest of the country before those of his party, he almost single-handedly prevents a near certain war with France and possibly civil war at home. The price he paid was a very badly split Federalist Party that refused to unite behind him when he sought re-election in 1800. Now, against this background of partisan resentment, Adams faced an increasingly hostile relationship with France. It's unsurprising that Franco-American relations had been harmed by the Jay Treaty, which seemed to France to ally America with England, and also by the French practice of plundering American ships. There was also the issue of Saint-Domingue. By the time Adams took office, the revolutionaries, who were now led by a former slave Toussaint Louverture, were seeking to resume trade with the United States as a step towards full independence during the Haitian Revolution. The abolitionist Adams had no qualms about supporting the revolutionaries and saw a number of advantages in allying with them. A trade deal with Haiti would further isolate the island from French control. it would help the U.S. economy, and it might prompt the Haitian leader to close his ports to the French privateers attacking the U.S. merchant ships. In June of 1799, the Adams administration signed a three-way British-U.S. Saint Domingan trade agreement, and although that agreement was still unratified when Adams left office, in the last months of his presidency, Adams stationed warships outside Dominican ports to help quash any internal rebellion of conservative free people of color who wanted to reimpose slavery, while members of his administration discussed with Louverture the form that an independent Saint Domingan Republican government could assume. And none of this pleased France. You have to keep in mind that at this point Napoleon had stepped into power, and he had many imperial ambitions and was going around conquering different parts of Europe, and he saw Haiti and he believed that it could be a stepping stone into America, into the Louisiana Territory, which he could further conquer other parts of the nation after that. When Adams learned that the new American ambassador to France, Charles Pinckney, had been kicked out of the country because the French government would no longer recognize or receive an ambassador from the United States, Adams sent a new mission to France. He appointed Elbridge, Gerry, John Marshall, and Pinckney to lead the mission. But when they arrived, the French foreign minister Talleyrand made it very clear that he expected a bribe for his willingness to talk with these ambassadors. And such arrangements were not really uncommon in European politics, but to the starched and weary Adams, the idea was really abhorrent. He turned over all of the documentation of this affair to Congress and identified Talleyrand's agents by the letters X, Y, and Z. The American public was indignant about the XYZ affair, and this anti-French war fever swept through the United States. The Federalist, who had always warned against the French, enjoyed greater popularity at this point than they ever had or than that they ever would again, and Congress acted to upgrade the Navy and the Army and adopted Washington's suggestion that Hamilton be appointed second in command. In order to pay for this expanded Army and naval rearmament, which cost about $2 million, the Federalists pushed through the direct tax of 1798, which was a levy on the value of land, slaves, and dwellings. In addition, Congress suspended commercial ties to France, empowered American ships to seize armed French vessels, and continued to expand the nation's military, in what became known as the Quasi-War, because neither nation formally declared war. Between 1798 and 1800, the U.S. and France skirmished on the seas, with the U.S. capturing more than 80 French ships. In the Convention of 1800, the United States and France agreed to end these hostilities. France agreed to return captured American ships, the United States assumed Americans' claims against the French for damages in shipping, and the earlier Franco-American alliance was replaced by mutual most favored nation status. And while Adams may have helped end the hostilities with France, his direct tax was wildly unpopular. When tax assessors reached eastern Pennsylvania, settled predominantly by German immigrants, unrest became civil disobedience. Led by John Fries, men of the area raised a small army to chase collectors away, while women poured hot water on the assessors. When the governor tried to have the residents arrested, Fries' supporters freed them, and Adams sent a militia of 1,000 men to capture the leaders. Fries and most of the other leaders were arrested, tried for treason, and sentenced to hang. In the face of strong public sentiment, Adams pardoned these rebels, and this was the second uprising in less than a decade, and note that in both cases, the Whiskey Rebellion and Fries' Rebellion, the rebels were pardoned. The thought of Hamilton in charge of a huge army convinced many Republicans that their worst nightmares were about to materialize. The Federalists then passed 4 laws in the summer of 1798, known collectively as the Alien and Sedition Acts, that confirmed the Republican fears. We have these 4 acts listed here, and the most dangerous in the minds of Republicans was undoubtedly the Sedition Act. So, the Naturalization Act first wanted to curb criticism from immigrants, both French and Irish, who the Federalists saw as identifying with Democrat Republicans, and so it raised residency requirements to 14 years and said that these people could not vote until they were a citizen. The Alien Friends Act gave the president the authority to deport people he considered a threat to the United States at whim. The Alien Enemies Act gave the president the authority to deport or imprison people he considered a threat to the U.S. in a time of declared war. And the Sedition Act made it a federal crime to engage in any combination or conspiracy against the government to utter or print anything false, scandalous, and malicious against the government, which is essentially censorship of the worst kind. The Federalist judges were blatantly partisan in their enforcement of the Sedition Act. 25 individuals, mostly Republican editors, were indicted under the act, and 10 were convicted. Facing a Supreme Court dominated by Federalists, Jefferson and Madison turned to the safely Republican legislatures of Kentucky and Virginia for resolutions that attacked the constitutionality of the acts, and they produced the first significant articulation of states' rights. The resolutions known collectively as the Virginia and Kentucky Resolves were adopted in the fall of 1798 and proposed a compact theory of the Constitution. They asserted that the states had delegated specific powers to the national government for their common benefit, and it followed that the states reserved the right to rule whether the national government had unconstitutionally assumed power not granted to it. If a state decided that the national government had exceeded its powers, it could interpose its authority to shield its citizens from tyrannical law. In a second set of resolutions, the Kentucky legislature introduced the doctrine of nullification, which is the right of a state to render null and void a national law it deemed unconstitutional. And of course, this is different than the present day because this would be a job today for the Supreme Court. Now, the aim of Kentucky and Virginia with this nullification issue was not necessarily to break the Union up, but they wanted to preserve the Union by protecting their civil liberties. And this concept of nullification is going to become very important in American history because it will later be used by Southerners to support nullification and ultimately to secession just prior to the American Civil War. Jefferson and James Madison hoped that these resolutions would rally voters to the Republican Party as the defender of threatened American liberties, but not a single additional state seconded them. In the end, what aroused popular rage against the Federalists was not legislation directed towards aliens and subversives, but the high cost of Federalist taxes. Fry's rebellion reflected an air of menace that tore through the country as the presidential campaign of 1800 approached. The army was chasing private citizens whose only crime in the eyes of many was that they were honoring their revolutionary heritage by resisting hateful taxes. Federal soldiers also roughed up Republican voters at polling places. Southern Republicans talked in private of the possible need to resist Federalist tyranny by force, and failing in that, to secede from the Union. Hamilton and his backers, known as the High Federalists, saw in the Kentucky and Virginia resolves a regular conspiracy to overturn the government. No one did more to diffuse this charged atmosphere than President John Adams. The Federalists depended for their popular support on the expectation of war on France, which as late as 1798 had swept them to victory in the congressional elections. But still, Adams refrained from asking for a declaration of war, which would have helped his party. He recognized that war with France could trigger a civil war at home, and Hamilton and the High Federalists, he feared, would use war as an excuse to crush the Republican opposition in Virginia. So fearful of Hamilton's intentions and unwilling to run the risk of militarizing the government, Adams broke with his party and decided to reopen negotiations with France in February of 1799. The Franco-American Accord of 1800 that resulted from Adams' initiative released the United States from its 1778 alliance with France, and in return the U.S. surrendered all claims against the French for damages done to American shipping. The prospect of peace with France deprived the Hamilton Federalists of their trump card in the election. The Republicans could no longer be branded as the traitorous friends of an enemy state. The enlarged army with no foe to fight became a political embarrassment, and the Federalists dismantled it. Although rumors of possible violence continued to circulate, the Republicans grew increasingly confident that they could peacefully gain control of the government. The Federalists, hampered by party disunity, could not counter the Republicans' aggressive organizational tactics. They found it distasteful to appeal to common people. Wherever the Republicans organized, they attacked the Federalists as monarchists, plotting to undo the gains of the Revolution. The Federalists responded with emotional appeals that depicted Jefferson as a godless revolutionary whose election would usher in a reign of terror. The effect, intoned the Reverend William Lynn, would be to destroy religion, induce immorality, and loosen all bonds of society. Attacks like Lynn's reflected the fears of Calvinist preachers that a tide of disbelief was about to submerge Christianity in the United States. Deism, an Enlightenment religious philosophy popular among leaders of the Revolutionary era, was making inroads among common citizens as well. Deists viewed God as a kind of master clockmaker who created the laws by which the universe runs, but otherwise leaves it alone. They rejected revelation for reason, maintaining that the workings of nature alone reveal God's design. These developments convinced Calvinist ministers, nearly all of them Federalists, that the atheism of the French Revolution was infecting American republicanism. The Democratic Republicans won the election of 1800 by mobilizing voters through strong party organizations. Voter turnout in 1800 was twice what it had been in the early 1790s, and most of the new voters were Democratic Republicans. The direct tax of 1798 cost the Federalists the support of commercial farmers in the mid-Atlantic states. Artisans in port cities had already switched to the Republicans in protest over Jay's Treaty, which they feared left them exposed to a flood of cheap British imports. Adams carried New England and had a smattering of support elsewhere. With New York added to their solid base in the South and the back country, the Jeffersonians gained an electoral majority. Party unity among Republican electors was so strong that Jefferson and Burr each received 73 electoral votes. Consequently, the election was thrown into the House of Representatives, which until the newly elected Congress was seated, was still dominated by Federalists. Hoping to deny Jefferson the presidency, the Federalists in the House backed Burr. The result was a deadlock that persisted into the early months of 1801, when the Federalists yielded. Informed through intermediaries that Jefferson would not dismantle Hamilton's fiscal system, enough Federalists cast blank ballots to give Jefferson the majority he needed for election. The 12th Amendment of the Constitution, ratified in 1804, prevented a similar impasse from arising again by requiring electors to cast separate ballots for president and vice president at this point. As John Adams was about to leave office, he pushed through Congress the Judiciary Act of 1801, and with this act he added 16 new federal judges and 41 justices of the peace. All of the new judges were, you guessed it, Federalists. Adams hoped to influence future federal judiciary decisions by putting these Federalists into judicial posts. As he signed their appointments late on his very last day in office, they're called the Midnight Judges. And part of our next lecture on the presidency of Thomas Jefferson is going to begin with this controversy, because Jefferson, as the new president, has to decide whether or not to support the appointments that are made by Adams, and he throws the whole country into this controversy that's taken in front of the Supreme Court. In 1789, the American Republic was little more than an experiment in self-government. It could have easily dissolved. The Federalists, under George Washington and John Adams, provided a firm foundation for this experiment. Hamilton's financial program, neutrality in the wars of the French Revolution, and the diplomatic settlement with Britain in Jay's Treaty bequeathed to the young nation a decade of peace as well as prosperity. Federalist policies, however, provoked strong opposition rooted in conflicting economic interest and contrasting regional views over the meaning of liberty and government in this new republic. The Federalist coalition split during Washington's second term when Southern planters joined urban artisans and backcountry Scots-Irish farmers in opposing Jay's Treaty and the commercially oriented program of the Federalists. When Quaker and German farmers in the mid-Atlantic states defected from the Federalist over tax legislation of 1798, 3 of the 4 regions in Washington's America now lined up behind the Republicans in the belief that measures such as the expansion of the Army and passage of the Alien and Sedition Acts threatened individual liberty and regional autonomy. The openly partisan politics of the 1790s surprised the country's founders, who equated parties with the evils of factionalism. They had not foreseen that parties would forge a necessary link between the rulers and the ruled, and created a mechanism by which group values and regional interest could be given a political voice. To the credit of the Federalists, they relinquished control of the national government peacefully. The importance of this precedent can scarcely be exaggerated. It marked the first time in modern political history that a party in power handed over the government to its opposition without any kind of blood being shed. Party formation climaxed in the election of 1800 when the Republicans ended the Federalist rule. The Republicans won by embracing the popular demand for a more egalitarian social and political order. It now remained to be seen what the Republicans under Jefferson would do with this newfound power.